Content warning: this film discusses sexual violence and the coercion of children. If this subject may be distressing, please consider pausing now. The following scene is a composite reconstruction informed by archival patterns. Imagine a courtyard near a sugar mill. A girl stands barefoot on beaten earth, one hand still holding the thin braid that used to tie her hair. A blade has passed through the braid. The cut hair lies coiled at her feet. An overseer speaks a new name aloud, calm, matter-of-fact, so the people who hear it understand what the ledger will soon record. The girl's lips do not move. Around them the mill's drums drone, a background rhythm that makes private things sound ordinary. This is not a public auction. It is a private moment repeated in thousands of small ways across plantations. A renaming, a change of dress, an order given in a household room that turns a life into an entry on a page. For the purpose of this narration, we call this set of practices the sugar mill ritual, a frame for understanding how private acts and bureaucratic records work together to make human beings into property. Some elements of this pattern are documented in Atlantic slavery. Others are plausible reconstructions, drawn from comparative evidence and material traces. Wherever I move from reconstruction to evidence, I will say so plainly. Composite reconstruction. Amara. She is a girl born in a plantation village to parents who could not pay a small debt. The master claims the debt against the family. One morning, Amara is taken from the hut where she sleeps and led to the courtyard beneath the shadow of the mill's wheel. The overseer speaks over her a name that is not hers. A hand tugs at the last braid, cuts it clean, and tucks the hair away like a receipt. A seamstress presents a coarse dress with a small brass button stamped with the household sign. A house token becomes a substitute for a family name. Later that day, the ledger in the counting house is opened and a new line is written, an initial, a number, an age. This scene is a composite reconstruction. Renaming and the sale of children are documented practices across Atlantic slavery. Cutting hair as a widespread ritualized act in the British Caribbean is indefinito, and here treated as a plausible reconstruction informed by comparative accounts and material traces. Why begin with a single braid? Because hair, names, and clothing are the most intimate markers of identity. When they are removed or repurposed by an owner, the loss is not merely physical. It is an erasure enacted in public and recorded in private ledgers. Ledgers are not neutral. They are instruments of conversion. Names become numbers, people become assets, dependents become collateral. The sugar mill itself, its drums, its hungry boilers, its counting house, was the engine that made those conversions routine. Documented. Renaming, inventories, and the use of household registers to list enslaved people are present throughout plantation records. Baptismal registers often record a Christian name assigned at baptism. Sale records and estate inventories routinely list children along with their ages and apprenticeships. These sources show how legal and religious forms were repurposed to naturalize ownership. If this subject matters to you, and you want more work that reconstructs hidden histories, consider subscribing. Composite reconstruction. EC. She arrives on the estate as someone else's captive, brought from across the sea during a time of conflict. She steps off a boat with language she knows only in part and a name she still remembers in the dark. Within weeks she is baptized under a new name. The overseer records her in the household list. An entry in the sugar house ledger notes, SE12, house. She is assigned to the master's small house, where the line between domestic labor and intimate access is thin and enforced by silence. This sequence is composite. Reconstruction. Documented. The capture and sale of people from different places, the baptismal renaming of African-born newcomers, and the registration of their presence in household lists are well attested. Plausible reconstruction. The performance of a private welcome that includes symbolic grooming or an announcement in the master's room. Such acts are suggested in some narratives, but not uniformly documented across British plantations. Where I describe them, I mean plausible reconstruction, not universal practice. The crucial mechanism linking these scenes is bureaucracy, ledgers, credit books, apprenticeship bonds, and shop accounts. On paper, a child could be an item pledged against a loan. A mother's unpaid debts could be discharged by the assignment of her child to service in the master's house. In the counting house, the clerk's steady hand translated social relations into economic entries. That translation made dispossession routine, routinized, and legally legible. What do these records look like? A plantation ledger will often list names, ages, skills, and short notes. House, field, apprentice. A store account will show a child's clothing issued, sugar rations withheld, a charge against a parent for provisions. Baptismal registers show Christian names and sponsors. Estate inventories taken at an owner's death itemize human beings alongside livestock and furniture. The documentary trace is not neutral, it is a record of transfer. When the ledger adds a name, it can validate an owner's claim, but ledgers lie by omission as much as by commission. The absences tell another story. Missing mothers in a child's early entries, anonymous, unclaimed graves, names never recorded. The politics of forgetting has its own archive. Composite reconstruction. Miriam. An African-born mother labors at the mill while nursing a newborn. Debts mount in a ledger kept across the path in the counting house. One night a servant brings a formal paper. The master has assigned the infant out as an apprentice to a distant household, to be bound until 15. Miriam protests softly. The formality of the bond looks like concern for the child's training, but functions as transfer. Years later, she will find a letter in the register that lists her child by the master's surname. Documented. The removal and sale of children, and the use of apprenticeship bonds as mechanisms of control, are recorded in many sources. In some colonies, local statutes governed apprenticeships in ways that owners exploited. Court records occasionally preserve petitions by mothers seeking redress, though successful claims were rare. The pattern is clear in the documentary record. Children were routinely valued as movable assets, and legal instruments often masked coercion in the language of guardianship or contractual training. Gender shaped these dynamics. The forms of power that governed girls and women at the sugar mill were gendered in two senses. First, they were enforced by a system that read women primarily as reproducers of labor and property. Mothers whose children might be seen as future laborers or as collateral. Second, the private spaces of the house produced opportunities for sexual coercion that were not easily visible to public records, but are attested in slave narratives and some legal cases. Documented. Sexual exploitation of enslaved women and girls appears repeatedly in narratives, in court depositions, and in the private correspondence of planters. Language in those documents often seeks to normalize or euphemize coercion, references to keeping or domestic misbehavior, but the pattern is unmistakable. Plausible reconstruction. The idea of ritual-like private ceremonies used to authorize intimate access is supported by patterns across different colonial contexts. While not always recorded as formal rituals in British plantation files, comparative evidence suggests that masters and their households developed repeated practices that made coercion feel ordinary within the house. To speak of sexual violence in this history is to be precise and restrained. The accounts we have, when they surface, describe pressure, force, and the manipulation of authority. They do not depict intimacy transformed into consent by a name or address. To say simply that girls in domestic service were vulnerable understates the cruelty. To expand into lurid detail violates the dignity of those lives. Here, the historian's duty is to acknowledge, with care, that sexual access was often a part of the private regime that made claim to girls' bodies. Everyday surveillance was the architecture that supported these abuses. The master's gaze and the overseer's tally reinforced one another. A small infraction was corrected with petty punishments that functioned as reminders. A cut in a skirt, a day without sugar rations, a mark on a palm. The purpose was not always to punish as much as to teach compliance. The proximity of the house to the mill, the open sightlines, the constant rotations of laborers, these produced a pressure that made resistance costly. Yet resistance persisted, not always as grand revolt, but as small survivals that left traces. Women stitched names into hems, tiny signatures hidden beneath a child's garment. Mothers scratched initials into hearthstones. Men and women hummed songs in tongues that a master could not name. These acts are small, but they are evidence of refusal, mnemonic scratches and clandestine stitches that insist, "I was here." Documented. Archaeology and material culture studies have recovered such traces, hidden names in clothing, marks on headstones, and objects placed in graves that do not match the owner's declared identity. Slave narratives and oral testimonies recall songs and names preserved in secret. Plausible reconstruction. The interpretation of these marks as deliberate mnemonic strategies is informed by broader patterns of resistance in the African diaspora. The ledger's language deserves another look. Where a ledger records "child of X, apprentice to Y," the comma in the line is not neutral. It marks the reduction of a relationship to a legal status. Where a house list notes a girl's age and labor, it functions as both a counting and social definition. The counting house formalizes intimacy, turns it into a transaction that can be repeated, inherited, and defended in court. Sometimes the machinery of bureaucracy produced strange concealments. Owners would register births in baptismal books, but leave the mother's name blank. They would note apprenticeship bonds as benevolent education. Credit accounts would list board for child in ways that hide the price of a life. In this sense, paperwork is both an instrument of violence and a terrain of resistance. Families fought over entries, contested age lines, and sometimes, in rare cases preserved in court records, made claims to reclaim children. Those claims tell us how the system could be contested, however infrequently. Composite reconstruction. Lena. She fastens a small seam in the lining of her apron with a thread that will not show. Into that seam she stitches two initials, the name her mother gave her and the day she was born. She hides the seam under the hem of a dress she wears when she cleans the master's rooms. Years later, when the dress is worn thin, the initials remain, a secret ledger of her identity that no official record knows. These hidden traces matter in the archive because they are physically stubborn. Stones and textiles do not lie. A hearthstone scratched with marks, a thread preserved in a museum garment, a child's name whispered in a depositions. All of these are evidence that identity persisted despite administrative attempts to erase it. The politics of burial is another axis of erasure. In many plantation cemeteries, graves were unmarked or marked with simple temporary tokens. Owners did not always record burial places in the same registers that recorded births and sales. Anonymous earth covered lives that had been exhaustively listed in ledgers while alive. Archaeology sometimes recovers unmarked graves and the few objects placed with the dead. These silent places are a counter-archive. The absence of name does not mean absence of personhood. Rather, it records the success of erasure. What do museums and monuments owe to these private histories? Public displays frequently celebrate production and architecture, the mill, the owner's house, the scale of operations. But the wealth that fills glass cases came from lives often erased in private records. Ethical curation demands that museums name that truth, not only to show objects, but to show the administrative and intimate violences that produce them. Exhibits can foreground ledgers and baptismal pages not as dry documents, but as instruments of dispossession, explain how apprenticeship could mean forced removal, and display hidden traces, stitched initials, a small braid, a child's toy, alongside their documentary complements. To curators, I would say, let the counting house ledger be visible, with an explanation of its function. To educators, teach visitors that renaming is not merely change of label, it is legal claim. To public memorials, do not allow monuments that celebrate industry to stand without an acknowledgement of labor and loss. Remembering requires discomfort. We must be cautious in our language. The phrase ritual risks implying a formal, ceremonial cohesion that the documentary record does not always support. So use this frame carefully. The sugar mill ritual names a pattern in which private acts, performed with repeated gestures, combined with bureaucratic procedures to naturalize ownership. Some elements, renaming, sale of children, ledgers, are documented. Others, systematic headshaving as a mandated right, are indefinito in British plantation records and presented here as plausible reconstruction, drawn from analogous evidence. I will be explicit when a claim is documented and when it is reconstructive. Composite reconstruction. Tama. She hides a piece of her braid within the lining of a child's rag, keeping a curl wrapped in thread. The braid will travel with garments, halting the master's effort to dissolve the memory of her lineage. When she dies, a neighbor finds the thread and sets it aside. Years later, a descendant displays it in a family altar. The braid becomes a mnemonic object, small, ordinary, and stubbornly resistant to the counting house. This is the ethical pivot of the story. These individuals were more than line items. They maintained names in songs, left marks on hearths, stitched identities into clothes, and refused total erasure. Their survival is material as much as social. As we close, think of an empty cradle. The straw inside is flattened in the middle, a faint outline of a body that once lay there. On the cradle rail, a short braid is tied with a faded thread. Nearby, a hearthstone bears a single scratched line, and, beneath it, letters that may be a name. The objects are small, their significance is vast. The final frame is also a direction to those who curate memory. Recognize the private violences behind public wealth. Make the ledger a site of telling. Show the hidden stitches and the scratched stones. Invite descendants to speak, to claim, and to correct archival silences. Preserve the object evidence alongside the documentary pages that once transformed lives into numbers. This film has used composite reconstructions, where the record is partial, and has labeled practices as documented or plausible reconstruction as indicated. The renaming of enslaved people, the listing of children in ledgers, the sale and apprenticeship of children are practices that are documented in plantation sources. Sexual exploitation and domestic control are also documented patterns. Where I discuss grooming or ceremonial head cutting as a systematic practice in British sugar mills, I have described those details as plausible reconstruction when the evidence is not uniform. Production research should verify any such claim against primary sources before asserting it as proven. If you would like to learn more about the individual practices and the sources that support them, please subscribe to the channel. We will continue to examine ledger pages, baptismal registers, slave narratives, sale records, court petitions, and archaeological reports, the types of primary materials that historians use to reconstruct these lives. Final image: the empty cradle, the small braid tied with thread, the hearthstone with a scratched line. A soft voice sings a lullaby in a language the master cannot name. The stitch remains hidden, but not erased. Note for production: this script requires explicit on-screen tags at the start of dramatized scenes, composite reconstruction, and short captions in analytical moments marking claims as documented or plausible reconstruction. Primary sources to consult during production research include plantation ledgers and account books, baptismal and parish registers, estate inventories, sale records, apprenticeship bonds, slave narratives and oral testimonies, court depositions and petitions, and archaeological reports. Where possible, include descendant consultation and archival provenance for artifacts.